I received an email today, and when people bring a question to me or a concern, I like to address it also publicly, hoping it will help others, because I think there's got to be other people out there with similar concerns, especially if it's a good question. And it's always a good question. But this person said, they're struggling with sin and feeling kind of defeated and upset with themselves, frustrated, and they've been listening to people, that teach grace, teach the gospel, and he or she said, well, why don't I hear you guys talking more about your struggle with sin? And that's a really, really good question. And they said they felt very alone. Like maybe they're the only one that's having this struggle and they don't know who they can talk to about it. And first of all, you are never alone as a believer with your struggle with sin. Paul had it and he talked about it, and we all have it, because we have our spirit that's made alive in Christ. We have the mind of Christ, but we also have our flesh and our mind, our carnal mind, that can be influenced by outside influences and false doctrine and just our, whatever crazy thoughts. The enemy that wants to get in our head. Your flesh is lusty in some way. The flesh wants what the flesh wants, right? And I believe the reason that we don't talk a lot about our struggle with sin is because we're not sin focused. To be sin focused is to be law focused and to feel condemnation, right? It's to get your eyes off of Christ and onto yourself, off of his righteousness, and onto your own lack of what you think is a lack of righteousness in yourself and your own failure, right? Now we've got to admit or realize what a failure we are to come to Christ in the first place. And we need to continue to realize, in order to believe and trust and lean on him and not get religious and self-righteous later on after we're believers, we need to remember that to crucify our flesh, both so-called good and bad, that it has been crucified with Christ, and our righteousness comes from Christ alone, and we can do nothing apart from him. Now, so if we talk a lot about sin, which I have noticed the channels that don't have the gospel right and the Lordshippers and all of those, they tend to focus a lot more on sin, right? And that struggle, because they are not understanding that Christ took care of the sin problem. And being focused on that is just going to stunt your growth and leave you in a feeling of frustration and disappointment and condemnation. So what we do, because a ministry is the ministry of reconciliation, to build you up in him, to get you rooted and built up in Christ Jesus, right? And for that, your eyes have to be on him, and you need to abide in him, which is trusting and believing in him, renewing your mind, washing in the water of the word, agreeing with him about, this is walking in the Spirit, to agree with him about what he says about, God says the record God has concerning his son, and now who he says you are in him, in spite of your feelings, in spite of your circumstances. So you're feeding on Christ, you're eating of the bread of life and drinking of that living water and enjoying him. And and when you are doing that, you have this overflow, this joy and this thanksgiving, when you realize how loved you are and how much he delights in you just because you are his child. And when he looks at you, he sees the righteousness of Christ, and he's not judging or condemning you, but he loves you just because you're his child. And this creates joy and fullness, and you just get filled up in him, in his love, and it causes an overflow, which is like a fragrance of Christ to others, and it allows you to minister to others as well. When we're focused on ourselves, we are not going to have anything to give. we're just going to be struggling, having that battle within ourselves all the time. And we tend to put those same demands on others as well when we're being hard on ourselves that way. And it's not real ministry. But the point is, when you have two sources now as a believer, you can try to source from outside sources or from Christ in you, the hope of glory. You go to him and he fills you up with that. You know, that bread and water are satisfying. They're filling spiritually. And that's how you walk in the Spirit. And he says, you, by walking by the Spirit, you put to death the deeds of the flesh, both good and bad, you know, so-called good and bad. So what it does when you are eating and drinking of Christ, full assurance of faith, you not letting sin condemn you and turn your face away, getting you to turn your face away from God in self-condemnation, but believing instead what he has said about you, you'll realize that you aren't so hungry to feed your flesh. You understand? You're not going to another source to feel that thirst and that hunger. That's how it happened to me, where if I do mess up, I just dust myself off, just get back up again, go right back to Father, and stand on his word. That's all you can do. You believe, that's your job. Believe him, moment by moment, day by day. Agree with him. That's how his Spirit is able to work in you. And even when you are feeling defeated by sin and frustrated, he will use that too, because he will use that eventually to bring you to the end of your righteousness, where all you can do is just grab hold of him and his grace. So really, guys, there's nothing to stress or have anxiety about. He's got you covered. That's really why, you can know you're not alone on the one hand in your struggle with sin. And on the other hand, the only answer to that is to put your eyes on Christ and not focus on yourself. No matter what is going on with you, no matter what you're struggling with, you don't feed your hunger and thirst by focusing on your hunger and thirst. You feed it, right? You can choose to either feed your flesh or feed your spirit. I prefer to feed my spirit because that is what is truly satisfying. Anything else just makes you feel blah, right? So that's my best advice and my best answer. So I really hope that helped, and I hope some of you benefited from this message. And I love you. All right, bye-bye.